Hi friends, just before we dive into today's episode, I want to ask a huge favor from you. Would you please consider being a supporter of the Why Catholic podcast? There's 4 ways you can do this. First, you can become a patron and financially support this podcast. The basic level is $5 a month. To become a patron, go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Secondly, you can support this podcast by purchasing something from the Why Catholic merch shop on Etsy. Just go to etsy.com/shop/whycatholic. Third, you can also support Why Catholic by sharing episodes with your community. And lastly, you can support Why Catholic by inviting me to come and speak at your next parish event. For more information about that, please send me an email at whycatholic@substack.com. Thank you, friends, for your help. I couldn't do this without you. If you have a Bible available and are in a place to read it, read along with me. Mark chapter 4, starting in verse 35. Quote, "On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to them, 'Let us go across to the other side.' And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with Jesus. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?' He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, 'Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?' And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, 'Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" End quote. Hi, this is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. If you're new to this podcast, welcome. As a quick introduction, I spent 39 years of my life in various Protestant circles, including 11 years as an evangelical pastor. I was the co-founder of a ministry called Christianity is Jewish, which focused on teaching the Jewish roots of Christianity. And at the age of 41, after an intense period of research and discernment, I came home to the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. We've been in a series on sacred scripture. We began talking about some of the generalities of scripture, how we think of it, how it came to be, and then we turned our attention more on how to interpret it. Today, I want to focus on reading scripture with a mindset of application. In other words, what's scripture trying to tell me? How do I apply scripture to my life? And to do this, we need not just read scripture, but immerse ourselves in it. We need to not be afraid to read it slowly and read it again and again. And we need to read scripture with a mindset of creativity, sometimes reading between the lines. Today, I want to show you a 3-step strategy I like to use when reading scripture. First is summarizing what we read, basically listing the big ideas. Secondly is immersing ourselves into the story, imagining being a part of the story and asking questions about what's going on. Third is analyzing the text and applying it to our lives. This is actually a note-taking technique called 3-column note-taking. I've linked to a description of it in the show notes. So if you want to try this exercise, you can get out a piece of paper, turn it sideways, and make 3 columns. In the left column, you'll summarize the key points. In the middle column, you'll add key details and questions about the text. And the third column is for analyzing what the text means, especially what it means to you. Today, I want to focus on this passage from Mark's Gospel account to illustrate how to do this. Let's first summarize the reading. Jesus and his disciples have just finished ministering to the people, and they get in a boat, or the text says a few boats, and set out to cross the Sea of Galilee. Jesus, exhausted from teaching all day, goes and takes a nap in the stern. Suddenly, this enormous storm ignites, and the disciples are afraid that the ship is going to sink. So they wake Jesus up, he calms the storm, he rebukes his disciples for having little faith, and the disciples are amazed at Jesus' ability to control the wind and the waves. Once we're done summarizing, let's immerse ourselves into the story. Close your eyes if you're not driving or exercising, and imagine being on that wooden boat. We're not talking about a large steel ship. We're talking about a modest-sized wooden fishing vessel. It's big enough for a hull or a stern where someone can sleep inside, but it's small enough that the disciples are afraid it's going to break apart and sink in the storm. Imagine how terrifying that must have been. See the fear on their faces. Even the seasoned fishermen were afraid for their lives. Imagine how afraid those who weren't experienced fishermen were. Now picture Jesus. Imagine you are going below deck to alert him. You're being tossed side to side and you can barely keep your balance. And then you look across the hull and see Jesus curled up asleep. How do you feel? Maybe angry or frustrated? maybe incredulous at the fact that someone could possibly sleep through such a storm. You all are trying to keep the boat from sinking, and Jesus is taking a nap. Now, picture waking him up. How do you imagine him? Does he seem groggy? Does he roll over and mumble, "Go away, let me sleep"? Exploring this question really gives us insight into Jesus' humanity, doesn't it? He's just finished teaching large crowds, and he's exhausted. He's so exhausted, he's fast asleep as this rickety boat gets tossed in the storm. Or you might picture him like that scene in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, which I've linked to in the show notes. Harry Potter, Hermione, and Ron are on the Hogwarts Express headed back to school. Suddenly, the train stops. It's jolted a few times, the lights go out, and these ghostly dementors appear. The young aspiring wizards are no match for these spirits, and a dementor begins sucking out Harry's soul. In the corner of their cabin is a man who appears to be sound asleep. He's been curled up in a ball with a blanket covering his face. Suddenly, the stranger gets up, brandishes a wand, and a bright light exudes from the wand, and the dementors flee. Maybe it was like that. Maybe Jesus was waiting for the right moment. Maybe he was waiting to be asked by the disciples for help. Maybe he wasn't groggy at all. Maybe he was Johnny on the spot, suddenly leaping up and taking aim at the storm. Then there's this puzzling thing Jesus says. He rebukes his disciples for their lack of faith. Why? Can you imagine how frightening of an experience that was for them? Why does Jesus criticize their faith? And maybe more importantly, how do you think he says it? Is it like a gruff fisherman? "Ah, you bunch of pansies, it's just a little storm. There's nothing to be afraid of." Or is he upset that they didn't wake him up sooner? Like, "You guys are no match for this storm. When are you going to learn to rely on me?" Or was it more compassionate? You don't need to be afraid of these storms. Now let's get to the analyzing and application part. And let's see if we can find a clue in the text that maybe gives us some insight. How about verse 35? What did Jesus first say to his disciples? He said, "Let's go to the other side." If a seasoned boater friend said, "Hey, let's go to the other side," and we got caught in a storm, I don't know about you, but I might be a little terrified and also a little peeved at my friend who wasn't paying attention to the weather. But this is Jesus. This is not just him giving direction. When he says it, it's a promise. Let's go to the other side. They didn't remember that Jesus wasn't just bringing them onto the sea. He was bringing them to a destination, the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Well, that's it. That's the end of the chapter, right? No. We can't stop there. Aren't you curious about what's on the other side? Remember what I talked about in episode 125. Sometimes chapter breaks fall in terrible places and we miss so much of the story and meaning by not continuing to read. So let's read Mark 5. Quote, "They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him any more, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, 'What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me.' For he had said to him, 'Come out of the man, you unclean spirit.' Then Jesus asked him, 'What is your name?' He replied, 'My name is Legion, for we are many.' He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there on the hillside a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, 'Send us into the swine, let us enter them.' So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The swineherds ran off and told in the city and in the country. The people came to see what had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had had the legion, and they were afraid. Those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, 'Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you.' And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed." End quote. Okay, step 1. Let's begin by summarizing what we just read. Jesus and his disciples end up in a region called the Gerasenes. As soon as they step onto the shore, they're confronted by this demon-possessed vagabond of sorts. He's been living in tombs in isolation, howling and beating himself up. The town has tried to deal with him by locking him up, but he keeps breaking out of their restraints. He runs up to Jesus, bows down, and shouts, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Jesus immediately recognizes that this isn't just some mental illness. The man is demon-possessed. And the demon reveals that his name is Legion, because it's not just one demon, but many. The demon asks Jesus to send them into a nearby herd of swine, which he does, and the swine, numbering about 2,000, run off of a ravine and drown in the sea. This sets the town into an uproar. A whole herd of pigs are dead, and the man that they were always afraid of is clothed and in his right mind. So they ask Jesus to leave, and he and his disciples get back on the boat and go. Let's dive a little deeper and immerse ourselves into this story. Imagine seeing this demon-possessed guy running up to you. What does he look like? Torn rags, dirty, mangy hair? How do you react? Do you want to run away? Do you want to try and protect Jesus? Maybe you reach for something that you can use as a weapon? But he's no threat. He bows down and calls out, "Jesus, Son of the Most High God." How does he know who Jesus is? Are you surprised? Are you like, "Whoa, what's going on?" But then it gets weird. They're talking in some sort of code. Do you think the other disciples recognize that Jesus isn't really talking to this homeless vagabond? He's actually talking to a demon? And then the demon asks to be cast into a herd of pigs. Why a herd of pigs? And considering pigs are not kosher for the Jewish people, why is there even a herd of pigs to begin with? What did the whole thing look like? One minute Jesus is talking to a demon, and the next pigs are falling to their death off a ravine? Take a few minutes to immerse yourself into that story. You may even want to pause the podcast here to give yourself ample time to reflect on it, and then jot down your own notes. All right, let's analyze and apply this story. Here's a few details that stand out to me. Jesus heals the man, and when the townspeople come to investigate what's going on, they see the man fully clothed and in his right mind. He was probably wearing only rags, if anything at all. So how did he get clothes? Jesus and his disciples clothed him. And after the townspeople tell Jesus to leave, he gets in his boat and heads back across the sea. Do you see the significance of that? Jesus went all the way across the Sea of Galilee just to heal that one man. How did you know of this homeless, demon-possessed man? We can only speculate. Maybe he had heard about him. Maybe it was a supernatural intuition. But Jesus had one mission. It was to rescue him. And no body of water, no intense thunderstorm was going to keep him from reaching him. This thought leads me to another. That was no ordinary storm. I have to imagine that that storm was the work of Satan. Satan knew Jesus was coming for someone he had oppressed in demonic bondage, and he threw the kitchen sink at Jesus and his disciples in order to prevent him from getting there. There's another part of this story that has always puzzled me. Why did Jesus cast the demons into the herd of swine? I want to speculate something here, and I want to stress that this is total conjecture. This is like reading between the lines, big time. This part reminds me of another story. You see, Jesus tells this parable, often referred to as the prodigal son. The story which we read about in Luke 15 goes like this. There was this father who had 2 sons, and one son said he wanted to go live his life and asked his father to preemptively give him his inheritance. His father agreed, and his son went on his way. Before long, the son had squandered all the money he had, and he was broke. And so just to make ends meet, he stooped to being a pig farmer. And he was so hungry that he longed to eat the pig's food. Suddenly, he came to his senses and thought, "This is ridiculous. My father has servants who are treated far better. I'll just go ask my dad if I can be one of his servants." The text says that when the son was far away, the father saw him, was moved to compassion, and ran toward him and embraced him and threw a party for him. There's this part of me that wonders, what was it that made the boy come to his senses? And I'd like to think that just when he's pining for pig's food, the pig suddenly went crazy, ran towards a ravine, and drowned in the sea. Is that what happened? I don't know. But what I do know is this. Don't ever underestimate how far Jesus is willing to go to rescue someone. That's what the story of the prodigal son is all about, and it's what this story in Mark 5 is all about as well. In John 10:10, Jesus says, quote, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." End quote. Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at Why Catholic Podcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.